In the tough, working-class streets of North Dublin, some names are spoken in hushed tones. Names that carry the weight of rumor, fear, and a history that lives in the shadows. For decades, one such name was Patrick Fitzgerald. To the wider world, he was just another man, perhaps a grandfather living out his later years. But in the tightly knit communities of Finglas, and in the guarded files of Irish law enforcement, he was known by a different name: Fishy. It was a nickname earned not through friendship, but through a lifetime of activity on the wrong side of the law, a career that was far more serious than anyone on the outside could have imagined. His story doesn't begin with a single dramatic act, but with a slow, steady accumulation of offenses. On paper, his criminal record, stretching back to the 1990s, seemed almost mundane at first glance. It listed 72 prior convictions, a number that sounds staggering, yet the vast majority were for minor traffic violations. He was a man who, it seemed, simply had a problem with the rules of the road. But was that the whole story? Or was this long list of small infractions a kind of smokescreen? A diversion that kept the true nature of his work hidden from view. For those tasked with policing Dublin's complex underworld, the answer was clear. They had long suspected that Fitzgerald was not just a careless driver, but a key player in organized crime. The first true glimpse behind the curtain came in 2006. It was a moment where the official narrative of a petty offender shattered, revealing something far more significant. Police stopped him during a routine check, and inside his car, they found something that couldn't be explained away. Tucked inside the spare tire was a bundle of cash amounting to nearly 48,000 euros, the equivalent of roughly $60,000 at the time. It was a classic gangster's trick, the kind you see in movies, but this was real. When questioned, Fitzgerald boldly claimed the money was his, a legitimate nest egg. But this is where his story intersects with a powerful force in Irish justice: the Criminal Assets Bureau, or CAB. Established in the mid-90s, the Bureau's purpose was unique. It wasn't designed to put people in prison, but to hit criminals where it hurt the most: their wallets. CAB investigators had the power to seize assets if they could prove, on the balance of probability, that the wealth came from illicit activities. And for them, a grandfather with a record of traffic offenses having $60,000 hidden in a tire didn't add up. They took him to court, and under a CAB order, they proved the money was linked to criminal proceeds. Fitzgerald was forced to hand over every last cent. It was a major blow, and the first time the state had officially marked him as a man involved in more than just driving infractions. The whispers were true. He had ties to serious money, and by extension, the drug trade that generated it. This event seems to have marked a turning point. By the early 2010s, Fitzgerald was no longer just dabbling in the background. He had escalated his operations, becoming the leader of a prolific and highly organized crew based out of Finglas. This wasn't just a small gang of opportunists. It became one of the most active outfits of its kind in the country's recent history. Over the next 2 years, his crew was linked to around 20 targeted raids on businesses and properties across several counties, including Dublin, Meath, and Kildare. These were not quiet affairs. They were aggressive, calculated intrusions that often involved storming into family homes, leaving ordinary people deeply shaken as the crew sought cash and other valuables. The impact on these families was profound, a wave of fear rippling out from each incident. Yet, Despite the growing severity of his activities, Fitzgerald himself managed to maintain a surprisingly low public profile. His past convictions were still mostly minor, allowing him to operate without the intense media scrutiny that followed other crime figures. But within the walls of law enforcement, he was a well-known quantity. Specialist units were watching him, patiently building a case, waiting for the right moment. This brings us to a question that scholars and criminologists still debate. Does a long history of minor law-breaking serve as a training ground for a more serious criminal career? Or is it merely a parallel path, a smokescreen that distracts from the real work being done in the shadows? For Fitzgerald, the money from these raids wasn't just for personal enrichment. Authorities believed it was the financial engine fueling a larger machine, funneled directly into drug operations. By this point, his involvement was personal too. He had become a heavy user of cocaine, a fact that perhaps fueled the growing aggression that would come to define his reputation. The man who once hid in plain sight was about to become a force of open intimidation. As Patrick Fitzgerald's influence grew, so did his aggression. The man who had once operated in the background now stepped into the light, not as a leader, but as an enforcer. In his home turf of Finglas, he began to act with a sense of untouchable authority, using threats and fear to control his surroundings. For some local families, life became unbearable. They were subjected to a campaign of intense pressure, with Fitzgerald's crew demanding they allow their homes to be used to store drugs or weapons. It was a strategy of taking over through fear, turning a neighborhood into a personal stronghold. Neighbors lived in a state of constant dread, knowing that crossing him could have severe consequences. Some were bullied so badly they saw no other option. They packed up their lives, abandoned their homes, and simply left, seeking peace away from the shadow he cast. Irish police, the Gardaí, were relentless in their efforts to clamp down on his activities wherever they could. In 2012, they raided an empty house in Finglas that they had linked to Fitzgerald's crew. Inside, they found a makeshift cannabis grow house, a sophisticated operation with over 100 plants valued at roughly 40,000 euros, or about 50,000 US dollars. But they found something more: a handgun and a shotgun stashed alongside the drugs. It was a clear and chilling sign that the gang was now fully invested in both narcotics and firearms, a combination that almost always leads to greater peril. Still, even with these regular run-ins, Fitzgerald often managed to wriggle free, adding to his almost mythical reputation on the streets. He seemed to be one step ahead of the law at all times. In a 2014 case, police found a loaded handgun hidden in the garden of an innocent neighbor, a place they believed Fitzgerald had used as a hiding spot. He was brought in for questioning, a moment that could have landed him in serious trouble for a very long time. But once again, no charges were filed. There wasn't enough evidence to make them stick. For a man like Fitzgerald, an incident like this is a victory. It tells the world and his rivals that he is untouchable. But does that perception of invincibility eventually lead to carelessness? It was around this time, in 2014, that the first serious cracks began to show in his armor. In a shocking turn of events, a set of serious charges against him were suddenly dropped. To an outsider, it might have looked like another lucky break. But to those inside his own crew, it was a major red flag. Whispers and paranoia spread like wildfire through the gang. Had he cut a deal? Was he working with the cops to save himself? In the underworld, there is no greater sin than being an informant. The trust that held the crew together evaporated overnight. The consequences were swift and brutal. Fitzgerald was confronted by his own gang members, the very people he once led. The man who had built a reputation on intimidation found himself on the receiving end of violence. Just like that, the leader of one of Ireland's most feared crews was cast out, left with nothing. Insiders would later claim that despite the fortunes they had made, Fitzgerald was now broke, completely shut out from the profits. It was a stunning fall from grace. He even claimed he gave up his cocaine habit around that time, perhaps shaken by the betrayal and the realization of how far he had fallen. But anyone who thought that was the end of Patrick Fitzgerald's story was mistaken. He never truly stepped away from the life. He remained deeply connected to the network of Dublin's Gangland figures. By then, in his 40s, he began to transform his image, shifting from a hands-on leader to more of an elder statesman, a veteran figure in a world of younger, more reckless players. It was in this new role that he became entangled in one of Finglas's most brutal and well-documented conflicts. A vicious feud had erupted between two crews, one led by a young boss named Glenn Ward, and the other by a rival, James Whelan. The media gave Ward's crew a memorable nickname, the GucciGang, for their well-known love of expensive, flashy designer clothes. This small detail offers a fascinating window into the culture of these modern gangs, where image and status are projected through luxury brands, a stark contrast to the gritty underworld of old. This feud brought chaos to the streets, and Fitzgerald, the old veteran, chose a side. He threw his support behind Whelan's crew, acting as a mentor to the younger criminals. He even took a particular teenage up-and-comer under his wing, a young man who would soon find himself at the very center of the escalating violence. This raises a complex and debated question. What is the true role of an older, seasoned criminal in these modern gang wars? Are they a stabilizing force, trying to impose a code on the young and reckless? Are they respected advisors passing down their knowledge? Or are they simply relics of a bygone era, desperately trying to cling to relevance and power as the world changes around them? For Fitzgerald, this alliance would pull him back into the heart of the conflict, and the violence that followed was a grim reminder that in this life, the story rarely ends in quiet retirement. The cycle of violence in the Finglas feud was relentless, and Patrick Fitzgerald's involvement placed him right at its center. The conflict continued to escalate, and eventually his protégé's rival, James Whelan, had his life unjustly taken in the spring of 2022. His passing was not the end of the war, but merely fuel for a fire that was already raging out of control, creating new enemies and ensuring the need for retaliation would continue. But it was Fitzgerald's connection to a different plot, an attempted hit on another figure, that would ultimately mark the beginning of the end for his decades of freedom. His name was Gary Carey, a known drug dealer from West Dublin who, by late 2021, had made some very powerful enemies. On the night of November 17, 2021, the threat against Carey became terrifyingly real. He was visiting a house in a quiet residential neighborhood, and as he stepped out to his car around 7:30 p.m., a stolen black vehicle screeched to a halt, blocking his path. Within seconds, two figures opened fire, unleashing a volley of rounds at close range. Carey was gravely wounded, but in a stunning feat of survival, he managed to escape the vehicle, run back through the house, and leap over a garden wall as the attackers continued to fire. He was found collapsed by neighbors and rushed to the hospital. It was nothing short of a miracle that he survived. Surgeons worked to save him, but the ordeal left a permanent mark. One of the bullets remained lodged inside him, too close to vital organs to be safely removed. Fearing for his life, Kerry left Ireland as soon as he recovered, moving his family to Spain in a desperate attempt to escape the target on his back. Patrick Fitzgerald was not one of the shooters that night, but his role was absolutely vital. He was the architect behind the scenes, the man who handled the logistics that made the ambush possible. In the days leading up to the attack, he purchased the 2 getaway cars, one for about $900 and a second for a similar amount. He was the one who filled the car with gas, scoped out the area in advance, and handed the vehicle over to the hit team. After the attack, while Kerry was fighting for his life, Fitzgerald helped the gunmen vanish, covering their tracks by ensuring the cars were found burned out and abandoned. This is where the story shifts from brute force to the patient, meticulous work of modern policing. Investigators were faced with a difficult case. There were no witnesses to the planning, only the aftermath. So they turned to the digital breadcrumbs we all leave behind. This is a reality of modern crime fighting that has changed the game entirely. Detectives painstakingly pulled countless hours of CCTV footage from cameras all across the city, and then began the long process of cross-referencing that visual data with phone records. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. They could see Fitzgerald driving the cars in the days before the attack. They could trace his movements, placing him at the center of the plot's preparation. He wasn't the trigger man, but the evidence proved he was the logistical backbone of the operation. Curious about more stories like this? A simple subscribe goes a long way. The tragic postscript to this chapter is that Gary Kerry's survival was only temporary. Just 7 months later, after briefly relocating, he returned to Dublin. In a separate incident in the summer of 2022, his life was finally taken. Fitzgerald was not involved in that fatal attack, but it didn't matter. The police had already built an undeniable case linking him to that first attempt on Kerry's life. He was arrested and charged. Even then, while out on bail for one of the most serious charges of his life, Fitzgerald couldn't stay out of trouble. In what can only be described as a stunning act of recklessness, he took part in a violent home invasion in August of 2023. He and several others stormed a home in the early hours, targeting the relatives of a former bank employee. Inside were an elderly couple in their 70s, their adult daughter, and a 6-year-old child. The family was subjected to a terrifying ordeal as the gang ransacked their home. This single act speaks volumes. It raises the most profound and unresolved question about a man like Fitzgerald. Why would a career criminal, already facing decades in prison, commit another high-risk crime, and one involving innocent children and the elderly? Was it desperation? A deep-seated sense of invincibility? Or was he so fundamentally shaped by a life of intimidation that he was simply incapable of stopping? Facing overwhelming evidence, he eventually pleaded guilty to facilitating the criminal organization in the attempt on Kerry's life. For the home invasion, he was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. In mid-2025, Patrick Fishy Fitzgerald, now in his late 40s, sits behind bars, awaiting a final sentence for his role in that assassination plot. After a lifetime spent moving through the shadows of Dublin streets, a man who survived feuds, betrayals, and dozens of convictions, the clock has finally run out. When a story like this comes to a close, with the central figure finally behind bars, it's easy to think of it as an ending. Justice, in its own way, has been served. The legal system, through painstaking police work and the weight of evidence, eventually caught up to a man who, for decades, seemed to be untouchable. His downfall serves as a reminder that no matter how carefully a life of crime is constructed, the foundations are always unstable. The same paranoia, violence, and betrayal that he used to build his reputation ultimately became the very tools of his undoing. But does the story ever really end for the communities scarred by these actions? The feuds leave behind broken families and a legacy of fear that can linger for generations. The true cost is measured not in prison sentences, but in the trauma carried by victims of home invasions and the quiet grief of neighborhoods that lost their sense of safety. Patrick Fitzgerald's life was a testament to the destructive power of intimidation. But his capture is a testament to the quiet persistence of those who seek to restore order and peace. And so, we are left with a final, lingering thought. When one shadowy figure is removed from the board, does it end the game? Or does it simply create a void, waiting for the next person to step in? The answer remains as complex and uncertain as the human heart itself.